Is it cheaper to drive or fly from Virginia to Colorado and back? I just spent 12 days snowboarding out west and I tracked every single penny it took me to get there and back. And by the end of the video, I will give you a definite answer on which one is cheaper. In this video, we are going to be breaking it down into 3 parts. What I was able to pack driving versus flying, the total travel time, because at the end of the day, time is money, and finally, what it actually cost me. So let's start off with what I was able to pack. So obviously, since I was driving to Colorado rather than flying, I was able to pack a lot more gear than if I would have been flying. So I ended up bringing 3 snowboards, all having bindings on them. I brought 2 pair of boots. I also brought my helmet. I also brought my laptop. I brought a bunch of camera gear. I also was able to bring a bunch of different tools. And then also I brought a cooler with a bunch of snacks and drinks in it. I also brought a bunch, like way too many clothing for the trip. I also picked up my buddy Jim on the way, and since I was driving, I was able to pack 3 sets of skis for him, 2 ski boots for him as well, along with his helmet, camera gear, and all of his clothing as well. Now let's move over to the packing list in which I would have brought if I would have flown. Obviously, if I would have flown, that packing list would have gotten a lot smaller. For starters, I would have only been able to bring 2 snowboard decks and 1 set of bindings rather than 3 snowboards all with bindings on them. I would have been able to bring only 1 pair of snowboarding boots rather than 2. I also still would have been able to bring my helmet, still would have brought my laptop, but instead of being able to bring all of that camera gear, I would have only been able to bring 1 GoPro and probably just 1 of the other cameras. Also, I would have been able to bring a lot less clothing and base layers, but if I would have done it that way, I might have had to pay to do like some sort of like dry cleaning or laundry while I was there. So obviously, thus far, driving, you're just gonna be able to bring a lot more gear than you would have otherwise been able to bring if I would have flown. But I feel like that's kind of obvious. So now let's move over to how long it actually took me to drive there versus how much travel time it would have been if I would have flown. So when I drove, I ended up waking up at around 3:30 in the morning on Friday. About halfway, I was able to pick up my buddy Jim, which was fun because it just made the drive that much more enjoyable. We got to hang out together on the trip, and then also it allowed us to alternate who was driving, and the other person was able to take a nap, so we were able to get there a lot quicker. I also took the toll roads driving out there, which we'll get into later when we talk about the pricing, but taking the toll roads did end up saving me about 2 hours of driving each direction, so saving me a total of 4 hours on the road if we're talking about going there and back. After picking up Jim, we still had about 17 hours to go on the road, so finally we ended up getting to Denver, which was about 2 hours from our final destination, which was a condo in Keystone. And so in Denver, we ended up linking up with my little brother Jonah. He showed us his office. We also got to go hang out at the largest skate park in Colorado, and then he also took us to one of his favorite Mexican joints that's right down the road from his house, which I will say was the best meal we had on the entire trip. So after hanging out with Jonah, we got back in the car and continued our trek. That remaining portion of the trip took about 2 hours. So from when I left all the way until we actually arrived at our condo in Keystone took just over 38 hours. However, we did stop and hang out with Jonah for about 8 hours, which I'm not going to count as travel time because that was just us hanging out with him. So in total, it took me 30 hours of travel time to get from Virginia to Colorado. So now going home, Jim had to fly home because he had to get to work bright and early the next day. So I dropped him off at the airport and actually did the entire drive from Colorado to Virginia by myself. I did stop halfway at Jim's house and give him his skis that he left with me since he couldn't bring those on the plane with him. Thankfully, he's en route, so it didn't add any additional time to my drive. However, the difficult part was that since I was doing that trip solo, unlike going there where Jim and I were able to swap off who was driving so the other other person could nap while the one person's driving. When I was coming home, I was doing it all by myself. So I ended up stopping at a truck stop and sleeping in my car for about 4 hours, which was the only amount of sleep I got on the entire trek home. So going home, I will count that sleeping towards my travel time, because if I would have been flying, I wouldn't have had to do that. So going home, it ended up taking me 34 hours, meaning that total travel time was 64 hours by car. Now let's move over to my hypothetical fly travel time. So if I would have flown, let's just assume I would have woken up at the same time, 3:30 in the morning, and would have gotten in my car and driven to the airport. Driving to the airport from where I'm at would have taken about an hour still. Once I got into the airport, I'm assuming that it would have taken me about 2 hours worth of finding parking, unloading my car, catching a shuttle to get to the gate, going through TSA and all that fun stuff. I'm assuming all that would have taken me about 2 hours. Finally, once I would have gotten onto the plane and taken off, it would have been about 4 hours of flight time to get from Virginia to Colorado, and I'm assuming that it would have flown into the Denver International Airport. Now, that's also with a big assumption that there wouldn't be any sort of delays or anything like that. So 4 hours of flight time. Then once I landed, I would have had to figure out a rental car situation. Most likely what I would have done, and what I've done multiple times in the past, is I would have rented a Turo. So once I landed, between finding my bags and finding the rental car and getting all that situated, I'm assuming this would have taken me around an hour. Now, this is also with another big assumption that if Jim would have been meeting me out there, I would have had to make sure that we perfectly timed our flights so that they would have landed at the exact same time. Otherwise, I could have been stuck waiting for him at the airport for hours, or vice versa. Maybe he would have been stuck waiting for me, but we're just going to assume that we perfectly timed it up to where we both got to the airport. So now we have gotten our luggage, we've gotten in our rental car, and now it's time to drive from the Denver International Airport to our condo at Keystone. And that would have taken us about 2 hours. So the total travel time would have been to get there about 10 hours. And then obviously coming home, we're going to assume the same thing. So another 10 hours. So that means that in total, it would have been about 20 hours of travel time if I would have flown. So as you can see here, no surprise, flying would have only been 20 hours, driving would have been 64. So I would have saved myself about 44 hours of travel time if I would have decided to fly over driving. So thus far, since I drove, I was able to bring a lot more gear on my trip. However, I did sacrifice a lot of time spent traveling, about 44 hours more travel time by driving than if I would have flown. So now let's move over to the third and final part of this video, which is going to be the cost. How much more or less money did I spend by driving? So as you can see here, I've got my Excel spreadsheet up that I made for the total cost spent to drive all the way from Virginia to Colorado and back. So as you can see here, I stopped for gas a total of 8 times on my drive out and spent a total of $217.93 on gas going to Colorado. Then coming home on gas, I ended up stopping a total of 7 times and spending a total of $209.42 on gas, meaning that I spent a total on gas to get out to Colorado and back home. I spent a total of $427.35. Now, moving over to food, snacks, and drinks while I was driving out and coming home. On the way out, I ended up only buying food 3 times, which I thought was pretty impressive when I was looking back at it, and ended up spending a total of only $29.39 while driving out on food and drinks. Then coming home, clearly I was a little bit more hungry and a little more thirsty. I ended up buying food and drinks a total of 5 times, and I ended up spending a total of $56.49 on food and drinks on the drive home. And once again, I ended up taking the toll roads to save me 4 hours of travel time, and the total money I ended up spending on tolls was $50.86. Then, as already mentioned before, I didn't spend a single dollar $1 on hotels. And then finally, you can see here that the total wear and tear I put on my car was around 4,000 miles for the entire trip. And I'm doing the entire trip rather than wear and tear just on driving to and from Colorado, because if I wouldn't have brought my car, I wouldn't have been putting miles on it while I was in Colorado. So I'm counting the total miles that I drove while I was on the trip, not just to and from Colorado. So you can see here what I did is I went to KBB and I plugged in how many miles were on my car roughly before I started the trip, and then if I drove an additional 4,000 miles in my car, and KBB said that my car would have roughly gone down in value by about $260. So I'm factoring that in here as well, which we'll get into in a second. Now, moving over to how much money I would have spent if I would have flown. So you can see here, the first category where I would have spent money would have been on my plane ticket. Now, since I was going there to snowboard, I would have had to get a plane ticket that would have allowed me to have a checked bag, because I would have had to check my snowboarding gear. And roughly that ticket would have cost me, because I went back and looked at what I've spent on plane tickets going to and from Denver before, and having a checked bag. I also had a little ChatGPT and Gemini homework, and really the number I came up with that I think was pretty fair was I would have probably ended up spending, if I would have been waiting and hunting for a pretty decent deal, I think I would have ended up spending around $450 on a round trip plane ticket. Then from there, I would have had to pay for parking at the airport I would have been parking at. It would have been $15 a day for the cheapest economy lot, which is pretty expensive for parking these days. And I would have had to pay for 12 days of parking, which would have made my total money spent on parking $180. I would have assumed that I would have had to get some sort of food while I was at the airport going to Colorado, and then some sort of food coming home as well. So I'm factoring in that I would have spent roughly about $20 going there, $20 coming home, for a total of $40 spent on food. Then finally, I would have had to get a car rental while I was out there, since I wouldn't have had my car to drive around in. And I was looking at something that would have been comparable, because I would have had to get something that would have been able to drive on I-70 in case there was snow. So I would have had to get some sort of SUV that is all-wheel drive. And looking at Turo, it would have cost me around $550 to get a rental car. And then I would have had to pay for gas to get from Denver International Airport to the slopes, and then from the slopes back to the airport. I'm not going to factor in any other gas that I would have had to spend on the trip, just the gas I would have had to spend to get from the airport to the slopes and then back. And I'm assuming that would have been about a tank of gas, which would have been about $35. So now for the grand reveal, what did it cost me to drive to and from Colorado, and then how does that compare to how much I would have spent if I would have flown? So the actual money that I spent to the penny to drive from Virginia to Colorado and back was $564.09. And then with the, I think, pretty spot on math in this hypothetical, if I would have flown, I believe it would have cost me around $1,255 to travel, meaning that by driving, I ended up saving myself $690.91. Now, this does not factor in that depreciation on my car that we talked about earlier. So if we're going to factor in the depreciation on my car, it actually cost me to get to and from Colorado $824.09, and then same number as before for flying, which would have been $1,255, meaning that the actual money that I saved, if we factor in the depreciation I put on my vehicle, I would say that I ended up saving myself $430.91. Now keep in mind, by driving, I was able to bring a lot of additional gear, which actually did come in clutch multiple times on the trip. Now, although I did get to bring a lot of additional gear on the trip, it did end up costing me a lot of additional time. And at the end of the day, as they say, time is money. And it did end up costing me an additional 44 hours of my life to drive from Virginia to Colorado and back. So with that said, do you think it was worth driving, or should I have just flown? And if you like this video, you'll probably like these videos as well.